My name is Yubin Park. I'm one of the postdocs working with the Emotional Wellbeing Network, and I'm really excited and honored to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Anthony Ong. Dr. Anthony Ong is a professor of psychology at Cornell University. He's a PI for an interdisciplinary network, the Human Health Lab. His lab and his work integrates 4 interrelated areas of health and well-being, which are aging, emotion, close relationships, and race and social class. His work has been published in high-impact journals, including Perspectives on Psychological Science and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And among the many awards he's received, he was recently awarded the Mid-Career Trajectory Award in Affective Science Award by the Society for Affective Science. And a fun fact you can find on Google. So in addition to the jazz, parking, and cooking abilities we've heard about from other speakers, he was once a breakdancer. So amazing. So with that, I'll pass on to Dr. Anthony Ong.
Thank you for that introduction. Let's see, I'm going to try. Oh, now I can screen share. Thank you. Let's see here. Okay, can you, oh, hold on a second here. Can you see my screen? Just to, yes, you can. Okay, so I want to thank Alyssa, Emiliana, Laura, Dacker, and the other presenters that you've heard from today, whose work I've long followed and admired. This is probably the most important slide I can show today, and it's to acknowledge many of the mentees, mentors, and collaborators that I've had the good fortune to work with and learn from over the years. This is just another representation of that previous slide. This was put together by one of my undergrad RAs, who clearly is a Star Wars fan. So what I'd like to do in this talk is to try to do 4 things. First, I'd like to say a little bit about what it means to study happiness, and here I'm being a little provocative in using the term happiness. I want to be clear that I'm referring to positive affect, although broadly speaking, of course, well-being need not be restricted to positive affect. So what does it mean when we say we want to understand happiness or positive affect? I want to suggest that to understand positive affect is to answer 2 puzzles of happiness. Does happiness change over time? And what distinguishes happy people from unhappy ones? The second thing that I'd like to try to do is, after having outlined what it is that we understand about positive affect, I want to say a little bit about how I think this understanding is incomplete. And this will occupy the bulk of the talk, where I'll focus on evidence of underlying mechanisms connecting positive affect and health. I'll then transition to some new work that suggests that health and well-being involves more than merely experiencing high levels of positive affect and low levels of negative affect. And then finally, after offering this analysis, I want to say what I think follows from this observation, that in thinking about health and well-being, we should be also thinking about dynamic aspects of our emotional lives. Okay, so first let me say a little bit about how social scientists have come to understand positive affect. And here, as I've suggested, researchers have thought about this in terms of 2 puzzles. The first puzzle is a longitudinal puzzle, a puzzle about how happiness changes over time. This is a slide that is courtesy of Laura Carstensen. I'd like to think that this is the tacit theory underlying most aging research, which is to say you can put any variable you like on the y-axis, and then we measure age. And the hypothesis almost always is that it will get worse with age. Um, and if you think that what I'm going to tell you next is that this is not true, well, sorry. In fact, we know that loss is ubiquitous with age in the domain of cognition, for example. We see, a raft of abilities declining with age. But actually, the story of aging isn't simply a story of decline, as it turns out. And in fact, much of the work that I'll be describing today was motivated by a phenomenon known as the paradox of aging, namely that despite the losses that we see across various domains, our emotions appear to be relatively well preserved with age. And here I'm showing you just some illustrative data that come from a national survey of adults. And what you see here is a general pattern of decline with age in negative emotions, such as fear, shame, and anger. With respect to positive emotions, you see a pattern of greater frequency across age cohorts in positive emotions, although there's some evidence that these age associations may be moderated by functional health limitations at the very end of life. Okay, those were actually cross-sectional data that I showed you. Here are data from 11 longitudinal samples comprising over 84,000 respondents spanning the ages of 11 to 106. And what you see here is the results of a coordinated analysis in which positive affect is best characterized by an inverted U-shaped trajectory, peaking in the mid to late 50s, as shown in the black lines, which represent here the meta-analytic trajectory. Negative affect, by contrast, is best described by a U-shaped curve, bottoming out in the late 60s. I should point out that these analyses were conducted by a former student of mine, Emily Bastarash. A second puzzle is what I'm calling the cross-sectional puzzle, and this has to do with the question of what distinguishes those who are high versus low in overall levels of positive affect. Now, there are many different ways to show this, but one way is to show the disparity in mortality between happy and unhappy people. Here's an example from the famous nun study, as many of you may know. This is a study involving Catholic nuns who in the early 1930s were asked to write personal essays about their lives. Some 70 years later, these essays resurfaced as part of a larger study on aging and Alzheimer's. And it was at that time that the essays were coded for the instances in which the words love, hope, interest, and happiness appeared. And what I'm showing you here is simply a plot illustrating how those nuns who expressed the most positive emotions in their essays, on average, lived 10 years longer than those who expressed the fewest. The gain in life expectancy here is actually considerably larger than the gain achieved by those who quit smoking. Well, that's one study, admittedly probably a cherry-picked study from a small select sample. This is a meta-analysis of 62 studies with a pooled sample of over 1 million individuals conducted by Andrew Steptoe. And what you see here is that most of these studies are to the left of 1, which is the hazard ratio, suggesting that positive affect and subjective well-being in general have a protective effect on mortality. Okay, so these are just 2 puzzles that social scientists have tried to understand about positive affect. And although the discovery that people who think more positively and feel good actually live longer is remarkable, it seems to me to raise more questions than answers. What exactly are the benefits of positive emotions? Why are they adaptive? So I want to turn now to some work that attempts to answer some of these more mechanistic questions. Here, given the theme of the webinar, I'm going to be primarily presenting research on the topic of positive emotions and its impacts on the body. So this work draws from various theories and models of positive emotion. And I want to share some work that we've been doing in the area of stress regulation and positive emotion. So again, this work draws from the stress buffering hypothesis of positive emotions proposed by Pressman and Cohen. The hypothesis being that positive emotions should attenuate physiological stress responses. So one marker, as folks know, of the sort of narrowed mindsets associated with negative emotions is activity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis and its end product, which is cortisol. This is thought to be an important mediator of the relationship between stressful life events and health outcomes. And so we're interested here in testing this so-called stress buffering hypothesis in a laboratory challenge study involving both older and younger adults. So this is a study in which participants are brought to the lab and they provide a baseline sample of salivary cortisol. They're then randomly assigned to either a positive emotion condition or a neutral condition. Participants then perform the Trier social stress task, which you heard earlier. This is a task that involves giving a speech followed by performing mental arithmetic. And just to give you a sense of the experimental environment, they have to prepare and deliver this speech in front of this guy who has this menacing look, and their speeches are being recorded. Salivary cortisol here is taken at baseline 20, 40, 60, and 80 minutes following the onset of the Trier. The 20 and 40-minute mark constitute the reactivity period here, and the 60 and 80-minute mark represent the recovery period. Each of these periods are modeled using a piecewise, simple piecewise linear growth curve. And so we're sort of modeling these two pieces as a function of the emotion condition and also the age group and the emotion by age interaction. And what I'm showing you here are the pattern of results that illustrate the effects of positive emotions. And essentially, we find elevated cortisol reactivity to the Trier, as evidenced by this increase in cortisol in the neutral condition. But we also find that positive emotions serve to buffer reactivity. This protective effect was further moderated by age, and so there's a significant age by positive emotion interaction here. I'll also note here that the effect for recovery was not statistically significant in these data. We've also looked at this outside of the lab as well, where we've tracked people's daily emotional experience and their cardiovascular responses. So in addition to cortisol, another marker of this narrowed mindset associated with negative emotion is cardiovascular activation, which represents our body's preparation for specific action. So positive emotions by this analysis should attenuate cardiovascular reactivity following negative emotions. And in one study, we found support for this. So on days in which people reported elevated levels of negative affect, there was an increase in their blood pressure, showing you systolic blood pressure here. But that association was relatively muted on days in which they also reported elevated positive emotions, a finding that's consistent with this, again, this stress buffering account. We've also looked to see whether this effect of positive emotions in the context of stress, which we see in the lab and in everyday life, also extend to those coping with major life stressors, such as the loss of a partner. One of the sort of pieces of science, one of the surprising pieces of science that drew me in this direction was the finding that positive emotions can co-occur with distress, even in the midst of grief. One of the, I think, most poignant examples of this, for me, reading this literature comes from earlier work by Camille Wortman and Roxanne Silver, who find that bereaved parents, these are parents who had lost a child to sudden infant death syndrome, these parents reported at 3 weeks post-loss experiencing feelings of happiness just as frequently as feelings of sadness, and at 3 months post-loss reported experiencing positive emotions with greater frequency than negative emotions. And as I said, this was a surprising finding for me, but it turns out there's now robust evidence of this in the literature. So this is a study that made use of prospective data. This is data from the MIDAS study, where we were interested in exploring the role of spousal bereavement and positive emotions in the context of naturally occurring levels of daily cortisol. So the advantage of these data is that they were obtained from a sample of bereaved adults, both prior to and after the death of a spouse. Those of you who do work in this area can appreciate that the majority of research is conducted after the loss has occurred. And so observations of divergent reactions to loss are often confounded with factors such as the quality of the loss relationship, as well as the current functioning of the surviving spouse. And so it becomes difficult to disentangle these influences in the absence of prospective data. So this study, in this study, we're able to identify a group of widows who had experienced a loss within 18 months of the follow-up interview and who were unmarried at follow-up. They were compared to a group of continuously married controls on both pre and post measures of positive and negative emotions. As part of the MIDAS data collection, participants provided samples of salivary cortisol 4 times a day, once at awakening, 30 minutes after waking, before lunch, and at bedtime on each of 4 successive days. And because these data are hierarchical, we analyzed the data using a 3-level model here, where cortisol is the outcome. And I'm just going to show you here the results here. So this figure shows that spousal loss, those who experienced a spousal loss had sort of a distinct pattern of diurnal cortisol. So compared with non-bereaved controls, bereaved respondents demonstrated significantly lower average wake-up levels of cortisol. And in addition, the slope of the diurnal cortisol curve was significantly flatter among bereaved spouses. In these data, there was no main effect of loss on the size of the cortisol awakening response. And this is probably likely due to the sample size, both in terms of the participants, but also in terms of the data, which in this study, there was only two occasions of measurement for the awakening response. Importantly, this effect was mediated by the change in positive emotions, the pre to post loss change in positive emotions. And this change accounted for this relationship. Okay, I want to turn now to this question of whether there are individual differences in people's abilities to capitalize on positive emotions, particularly during times of stress. This work draws on resilience as a mindset. And the primary hypothesis here is that positive emotions are a key component of what it means to be resilient, and that the secret that resilient people have, whether they can articulate it or not, is that they have they're able to tap into this sort of stress buffering effect of positive emotion. And we've had an opportunity to explore this in a study, in several daily diary studies, one involving bereavement and another one involving chronic pain. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the chronic pain study. So this is some of our earliest work on positive emotions, and this is a study in which we assessed daily emotions and also pain catastrophizing among chronic pain patients for 14 consecutive days. We assess trait resilience using this measure developed by Jack Block. It's called the Ego Resilience Scale. We also assess pain using anatomical figures in which participants indicated their level of daily pain across various joint sites and muscle sites. And we also assess their self-reported pain catastrophizing. And so we predicted here that to the extent positive emotions, again, represent this sort of active ingredient in what it means to be resilient, then trait resilience would be associated with increases in day-to-day positive emotions, and that increase in positive emotions, consistent with a broadening account of positive emotions, would attenuate the sort of narrowing cognitions that are associated with pain catastrophizing. And we found support for this in a series of multi-level mediation models. So trait resilience here predicts lower levels of pain catastrophizing through day-to-day reports of positive emotion. More recently, we've looked at this to see how robust this association is, and so this is a meta-analysis involving 29 observational and intervention studies. And the general finding here is that positive affect is associated with a decrease in pain severity among adults with chronic pain, and this is evident in both observational as well as intervention studies. Okay, this is a slide, an adaptive slide from Barb Fredrickson. It depicts the influence of positive emotions as an upward spiral, and I've joked with Barb that spirals can also go down, and so I want to turn now to the question in the last 8 minutes or so. This question of whether our understanding of well-being should involve more than a focus on overall levels of positive affect. So I was drawn to this work by a body of work suggesting that high levels of positive affect can have a costly side that may be associated with distress and even mortality. Those of you who are interested in reading more about accounts of this can find it in this wonderful volume by June Gruber and Judy Moskowitz. So the question that has animated our thinking in this area is, given that high levels of positive affect have been linked to both favorable but also poor outcomes, what are the factors that contribute to whether positive affect is adaptive or maladaptive for health? And we think that one critical factor may be time. This is a plot from Ram and Gerstoff, who distinguish measures of short-term dynamics from measures of longer-term dynamics. And what we're interested in here is this intuition that whereas positive affect that is enduring or slow changing reflects sort of global levels of affect, affect that is more fragile or fast moving may indicate something quite different. So just going to skip through this here. The sort of analytic claims that I want to make here can be, I think, summarized syllogistically. So one observes, for example, that there are individual differences in well-being. One further observes that emotions are important markers of well-being. One also observes that emotions are inherently dynamic. And both of these analytic points, what I'm calling 2A and 2B, help to explain individual differences in well-being. And so I want to say 2A matters and 2B matters. And just to forecast the conclusion, I want to also argue that the conjunction of 2A and 2B matters. That is, I want to suggest that in considering what accounts for individual differences in well-being, we may do well to move beyond the question of whether positive affect is high or low to a consideration of the interplay between level and dynamics. Okay, this is from my colleague Neelam Ram, and what I'm showing you here is a spaghetti plot of 150 adults that are assessed every day across 9 weeks on their emotions. There's a lot going on in this spaghetti plot. One thing that we'd like to know is whether these patterns of emotion fluctuations are somehow a barometer of well-being, and if so, how? This slide is simply to illustrate that individuals with the same mean can have different patterns of positive affect dynamics over time. And so this can be reflected in terms of the intra-individual standard deviation, which is a measure of how much a person's positive affect deviates from their mean. This can be reflected in the mean squared successive difference, which is a measure of the degree of affect instability. It can be reflected in inertia, which is the degree of autocorrelation or persistence of positive affect over time. This plot is a meta-analysis of 79 studies conducted by Hubin and colleagues. And what you can see here is that for each of these indices of affect dynamics, the majority of correlations with well-being are negative, suggesting that low psychological well-being tends to co-occur with more variable, more unstable, and more inert emotions. This is another paper from the same group led by Egon Dejonkheer, and this is a study that analyzed the affective time series from 15 studies. And what they essentially find is that when you account for the mean in positive and negative affect, many of the relations between affect dynamics and psychological well-being go away. To put it differently, these dynamic measures of affect could not beat the mean. Now one can argue that this is not a surprise, that the best predictor of trait well-being is a measure of mean affect. This potential for measurement confounding is the problem of intra-category variability that Bruce Doenren identified many years ago. And so one can speculate, as the authors of this paper do, whether the problem of detecting unique relations between these affect dynamic measures and well-being might be situated on the outcome side. So in collaboration with Andrew Steptoe, we had the opportunity to explore this question. So this is data using, data from the ELSA study. It involves using experience sampling data that Andrew collected as part of the larger ELSA study. And so in this study, we examined the question of whether temporal fluctuations in positive affect are associated with mortality in older adults. We're conceptualizing fluctuation here using the MSSD. And what we find is that independent of the mean, which does appear to have a protective effect on mortality, instability in positive affect was inversely associated with mortality. And this association was maintained after accounting for a number of factors, including negative affect and its instability. So at least in these data, we can say that we were able to beat the mean, although I'm sure there will be a rematch soon. I have maybe a minute or two here, and I still have 100 slides, but I'm going to see if I can zoom through some of the more noteworthy ones. So we've been interested in other ways in which to sort of assess positive affect dynamics. One way we've been interested in is looking at affect reactivity. So this is the magnitude of change in affect in response to daily events that may be both positive and negative. Many of these studies, though, involve daily stressors. There's a growing body of work here showing that greater affective reactivity to daily stress is linked to poor health and even mortality. Our work in this area really suggests that the problem is not so much whether you have or don't have high levels of positive affect. The problem is how do you get your positive affect? And it turns out that across a number of studies, we've shown that people whose day-to-day positive affect is contingent on external events are more likely to report poorer sleep. They're more likely to report elevated inflammation. And more recently, with my colleague Tony Burrow, we find in a study of African American adults that greater dampening of positive affect in response to daily racial discrimination is associated with greater depressive symptoms. One way we've thought about this is in terms of a model of resilience that emphasizes sustainability or maintenance of functioning. So sustainability here involves the capacity to maintain functioning. In our case, the capacity to maintain positive emotions in the face of stress. The form of resilience here can be illustrated by the rotational energy that's generated by the spin of a gyroscope, where the faster the spin, the more resistant the gyroscope is to perturbation. And so in a sense, resilience and sustainability here can be understood as the capacity to absorb perturbations or disturbances. And we're simply making this argument, we're advancing this metaphor in the case of positive emotions and stress. I'm going to, in the interest of time, sorry, I have so many slides here, but skip over some of this work on emo diversity. But the take-home message here is that we have found support for the notion that diversity of positive emotions, so not just variability and level, but diversity in the experience of positive emotions in daily life is associated with lower levels of inflammation. Okay, so just to kind of wrap it up here, if you accept the argument that temporal dynamics matter for well-being, then I think it's very difficult to argue that positive affect is a unidimensional label. Rather, I think a fuller account of what it means to be well, I think necessitates that we move beyond, whether positive affect is high or low, to a consideration of these dynamics. And some of these dynamics I talked about, but there are many others. And in my view, the challenge is to map out the theoretical terrain by identifying other intrinsic properties along which individuals can be characterized. I'll just also say that, these dynamics can operate over longer time scales. What I'm showing you here are the trajectories. These are hedonic affect well-being trajectories. What I'm showing you here are 4 classes of trajectories of hedonic well-being that are identified from a parallel growth mixture model using 3 longitudinal waves of the MIDAS study. These analyses were conducted by my postdoc, Dakota Cintron. And what you can see here is that there are 4 distinct classes. Class 1 shows individuals who are increasing in their positive affect and decreasing in their negative affect. Class 2 shows individuals who report stable levels of positive and negative affect that are middling on this scale, with negative affect being higher than positive affect. We actually think of this as a languishing class. Class 3 shows a deteriorating emotional class in which negative affect is increasing and positive affect is decreasing over time. And then finally, class 4, which is the largest class, shows individuals whose positive affect is consistently high and stable. So we think of this sort of enduring positive affect here, as well as stable low negative affect. And when you look at these classes in relation to mortality, what you see is that class 1 and class 4 had the highest rates of survival. So these were the improving class and the stable high class, respectively. And they're not indistinguishable, they're indistinguishable statistically. In contrast, class 2 and 3, that middling and deteriorating class, have the lowest rates of survival. And interestingly, they too are not distinguishable. Of course, we'd like to know what are the mechanisms underlying the benefits of enduring versus fragile forms of positive affect. And this slide, courtesy of Alyssa, is simply meant to illustrate possible directions for future work. I think the integration of stress resilience assessed at the sort of daily level with longitudinal assessments of well-being and health is a very promising direction. Of course, we want to study both of these things, short-term dynamics and long-term dynamics, together. And one can do this with the inclusion of measurement burst design. This is an illustration of that kind of design where dynamic resilient processes are characterized by these intensive bursts. And these bursts are then connected with longitudinal assessments over time. If you're interested in reading more about this, we've written somewhat about this along with my colleagues Ilam Ram and Nancy Sin. And with that, I know I'm a little over time, so I want to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. That was an amazing talk, and I'll try to moderate some questions. If you have any more, feel free to post it on the chat. So one question by Laura was, so she was linking it to the previous talk where we learned about the flexibility of physiology. So how does the finding that more variability is associated with lower well-being comport with the notion that more flexibility is more adaptive?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I think, I think this is not going to be a very surprising answer, but I echo the observation that it's going to be dependent on context, right? The context that, if you will, that I'm sort of advancing here is the interplay between level of positive affect and these various dynamics that I'm talking about. There are other contexts as well. So the interplay between context and variability, I think, is going to be really important to sort of, so just as I don't think it's very fruitful to ask whether, it's high or low levels of positive affect, it may not be very fruitful to simply ask whether variability is good or not. But what are the contexts in which it may be good, beneficial for health, and what is not? When is it not? It's also going to, I think, depend on the outcome. On the outcome side, and so I know that's not a very novel answer, but I think that's the standard answer for all of these hard questions, is that it's going to depend on context.
Great, thank you. Just piggybacking on that, are there any data linking, so going back to the basics, I guess, linking positive affect variability to HRV or bigger flexibility? So above and beyond the mean levels, do we know if the two variability are related?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can think of one study, and I might be misremembering it. A study that looked at, this is a study by Peter Koval, and I think that he found that, I could be wrong, but I think that he found that greater variability in positive affect, and variability there was measured by this mean squared successive difference, was associated with lower heart rate variability, which is consistent with this sort of, I suppose, account that variability might be a kind of marker of sort of dysregulation, and that might have as a readout, lower heart rate variability, but I can't be certain.
Thank you so much. And I think this was a question about the stress buffering study. Stacy asked if the cortisol data in study was published. Thank you.
We're trying to publish it. We're working on that. Yeah. Stay tuned.
And for the this is a question I had when I was listening to the amazing studies on bereavement and resilience. I realized that those studies use the composite of positive affect, and I'm wondering if you have seen any differences among discrete positive emotions, or have you ever looked at the differences?
Yeah, we haven't, and I think this is partly to do with the measures that we've used, that they are not really designed to measure discrete emotions in a way that I think those folks on this call would want to measure discrete emotions, and so so we haven't actually done a good job of measuring discrete emotions in our studies, which is to say, I think even though we're finding these associations, they're really silent on this question of whether you would see differential effects, at least in our data, of discrete positive emotions. I know that Lonnie in her work has found evidence of this. We just haven't done a good job of measuring kind of discreteness in the measures that we've used.